What makes this story genuinely compelling, even without exaggerating it into a full translation breakthrough, is what it might eventually lead to. And researchers themselves have been remarkably candid about both the promise and the uncertainty involved. If sperm whale codas really do combine smaller phonetic units into structured, context-dependent phrases the way this research suggests, that opens a realistic, long-term path toward eventually correlating specific patterns with specific social contexts, births, hunting behavior, group coordination, potentially even something resembling individual identity markers within a family unit, gradually building an actual working understanding of what these combinations tend to communicate, rather than just confirming that a combinable structure exists in the first place. That is a meaningfully different, much longer-term research goal than simply identifying vowel-like acoustic patterns. And researchers involved in the project have been explicit that meaningful translation, in the sense of confidently knowing what a given coda sequence communicates, remains a distant goal rather than something already achieved. Getting there will likely require years of additional fieldwork, pairing far more recorded codas against carefully documented behavioral context, essentially building the same kind of large paired dataset that made the current structural discoveries possible in the first place. Only this time, linking acoustic patterns to observed meaning rather than just to each other. The discovery has also opened up questions that go well beyond biology and linguistics into territory that is genuinely unusual for this kind of research. Project CETI has partnered with New York University School of Law's More Than Human Life program, specifically to examine the legal and ethical implications of AI-assisted animal communication research, essentially asking what it would mean, legally and ethically, if science conclusively demonstrated that another species possesses a communication system with genuine grammatical structure. Begush himself has said the team is thinking seriously about what finding these human-like structures within whale communication actually means for how animals might eventually be treated under the law, and what the underlying definition of language itself should even include once evidence like this exists. Those are not questions with easy answers, and to their credit, the researchers involved have treated the legal and philosophical uncertainty with the same caution they apply to the underlying acoustic findings, rather than rushing toward dramatic conclusions on either front. It also helps to understand a bit more about codas themselves, since the term does a lot of work in this story, and most people outside marine biology have never actually heard one described in detail. A coda is a short, rhythmic burst of clicks, typically somewhere between 3 and 40 individual clicks depending on the pattern, produced by a sperm whale usually while socializing with other members of its family unit, often during periods of rest near the surface after a long, deep foraging dive. Researchers have long known that different coda patterns cluster into recognizable types, sometimes called coda families, distinguished by the number of clicks, the rhythm and spacing between them, and subtle variations in tempo that earlier researchers, working before this generation of AI tools existed, had already begun cataloging by ear and by traditional spectral analysis. What the newer machine learning-driven research added was the ability to detect much finer internal structure within those already known coda families, revealing that individual clicks within a coda are not uniform pulses, but carry their own internal acoustic shape that, according to the 2025 findings, can resemble vowel-like formants, the same basic acoustic feature that distinguishes one vowel sound from another in human speech. In other words, researchers already knew whales used a repertoire of distinct rhythmic patterns before AI got involved. What changed is the discovery that each individual click within those patterns may itself carry additional structured information, essentially adding a previously invisible second layer of complexity underneath a layer scientists had already been studying for years. It is also worth putting this discovery in context against decades of broader research into animal communication, because sperm whales are far from the first species where scientists have searched for language-like structure, and the field as a whole has a long, sometimes cautionary history of both real breakthroughs and premature overclaiming. Research into dolphin signature whistles, individually distinctive calls, dolphins appear to use somewhat like names has been ongoing for decades, and researchers studying primate vocalizations, prairie dog alarm calls, and even honeybee waggle dances have each, in their own way, documented genuine structure and information transfer within non-human communication systems, without ever crossing into anything resembling full human-style language. That history matters here, because it gives useful perspective on how to weigh the sperm whale findings. Discovering combinable, structured, context-sensitive units within a communication system is a real and meaningful finding, one with a track record across multiple species of genuinely advancing scientific understanding of animal cognition. But that same history also shows why researchers in this field have generally learned, sometimes the hard way after past claims did not hold up to later scrutiny, to describe these findings carefully, distinguishing between evidence of structure and evidence of meaning, Exactly the distinction Project CETI's own team has been careful to maintain throughout this research, rather than rushing toward the more dramatic claim that whales have been fully decoded. That scientists just decoded the language of whales using AI, and that it is not what you think. The honest version is this. Nobody has translated whale language in the way people generally picture when they hear that phrase. Nobody is having conversations with sperm whales, and no dictionary exists mapping specific codas to specific human language meanings. What has actually happened is narrower, more rigorous, and in its own way more interesting than the exaggerated version. AI-driven acoustic analysis has revealed that sperm whale communication contains genuine internal structure, phonetic alphabet-like building blocks, vowel and diphthong-like, patterns, and context-dependent combinations, overturning a 60-year assumption that whale clicks functioned more like simple Morse code than anything resembling structured language. That is a real, well-documented, peer-reviewed shift in scientific understanding, achieved specifically because machine learning could detect statistical patterns across volumes of acoustic data that no human researcher could realistically process by ear alone. It is not the dramatic, fully translated whale-to-English breakthrough headlines sometimes imply. It is something more foundational, evidence that another species on this planet may be communicating with a level of structural complexity nobody seriously expected to find, with the far harder work of actually understanding what any of it means still sitting ahead. If you had to guess where this research goes next, full eventual translation of specific whale phrases, a permanent recognition that whale communication has structure without ever fully cracking specific meaning, or something in between that changes how we think about animal intelligence more broadly without ever producing a clean dictionary, drop your honest take in the comments, because after years of real field work and genuinely careful peer-reviewed research, an informed guess grounded in the actual evidence still beats another exaggerated headline. If you want more stories built entirely on documented research rather than invented claims dressed up as breaking news, subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications, because there's a lot more of this kind of investigation still worth digging into properly. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one. For 60 years, scientists assumed sperm whale clicks were basically Morse code, simple signals with no real internal structure, and every serious researcher who studied them built their work on that assumption. Then, a team of linguists fed thousands of hours of recorded whale sounds into machine learning models built to find patterns humans simply cannot hear on their own. And what came back overturned that 60-year assumption almost completely. The whales were not sending Morse code. They were doing something that looks, structurally, a lot closer to speech. And before you picture scientists having an actual conversation with a sperm whale, that is not what happened either, which is exactly the part of this story most coverage gets wrong. Stick with me for the next few minutes because I am going to walk you through what researchers actually found, how the AI involved really works, and why the honest version of this story is more interesting than the exaggerated one. And if you want more real investigations built on documented research rather than invented mystery, hit subscribe now, because that is the only kind of story this channel tells. To understand why this discovery matters, you first need to understand what scientists were working with before AI ever entered the picture. Sperm whales communicate primarily through rapid sequences of clicks called codas, short bursts of sound produced deep in the ocean, often while whales are socializing, resting together, or coordinating as a family group. Researchers have been recording these codas since at least the 1960s, and for most of that time, the scientific consensus treated them the way you might treat a simple signaling system, more about quantity and timing than anything resembling structured language. A whale click pattern was seen as roughly analogous to a radio operator tapping out a basic signal, present or absent, fast or slow, useful for identifying which whale was calling or roughly what social context the calls were happening in, but not something with internal grammar or shifting meaning the way human language has. That assumption held for decades, not because researchers were careless, but because manually analyzing the sheer volume of recorded whale sound needed to detect subtle internal structure was simply beyond what human researchers could do by ear, one recording at a time, across years of fieldwork. That is where a nonprofit research initiative called Project CETI comes in, short for the Cetacean Translation Initiative, a name deliberately built to echo SETI, the long-running search for extraterrestrial intelligence, because the people who founded it wanted to make the same kind of ambitious statement about listening for another form of intelligence, just one already sharing our own planet's oceans, rather than out among the stars. Founded in 2020, Project CETI brought together an unusually wide mix of specialists under one roof, marine biologists, roboticists, underwater acousticians, cryptographers, and machine learning researchers, all working together specifically to study sperm whale communication using tools no single research team from an earlier era would have had access to. Over the past several years, The project has deployed advanced biologging devices, small suction cup tags engineered by researchers at Harvard's School of Engineering and Applied Sciences, directly onto sperm. Whales off the coast of Dominica in the Eastern Caribbean, capturing extraordinarily high-fidelity audio alongside behavioral data during the whale's deep dives, footage, and sound that would have been effectively impossible to gather at this scale even a decade earlier. All of that raw material, thousands of hours of recorded codas, only became genuinely useful once researchers applied machine learning models, capable of detecting patterns across far more data than any individual scientist could process by hand. In 2024, the CETI team published research in the journal Nature Communications describing what they called a sperm whale phonetic alphabet, essentially demonstrating that whale codas are not just simple present or absent signals, but combinations of smaller building blocks, borrowing terminology from music theory to classify recurring click patterns that whales appear to combine into something resembling phrases, patterns that shift depending on the social context in which they occur. That paper alone represented a genuine shift in how researchers understood the underlying structure of whale communication, suggesting something considerably closer to a real communication system with internal rules than the simple, largely unstructured clicking most scientists had assumed for decades. Then, in late 2025, came the finding that pushed this story even further, and it is the part of the research that genuinely surprised people inside the field. A team led by University of California, Berkeley linguistics professor Gasper Begush, who also serves as the linguistics lead at Project CETI, used a type of machine learning model called a generative adversarial network, a system originally developed for tasks like generating realistic images, repurposed here to analyze the acoustic properties of whale calls with a level of precision no human ear could match. That analysis identified spectral patterns within sperm whale codas that closely resemble vowels and even diphthongs, the kind of gliding sound your voice makes when it shifts smoothly from one vowel quality to another within a single syllable, a feature considered one of the defining building blocks of human spoken language. The team documented 2 distinct vowel-like patterns, along with several diphthong-like variations, embedded within the timing and pitch structure of the whale clicks. As Begush put it when the findings were published, researchers had previously thought of whale communication as something like Morse code, but this research suggested their calls function more like very, very slow vowels, hinting at a level of structural complexity that genuinely approaches features found in human language. This is exactly the point where it becomes important to slow down and be precise about what this discovery does and does not mean, because it is also exactly the point where a lot of coverage of this story tends to run away with itself. Finding vowel-like and diphthong-like acoustic structure inside whale codas does not mean scientists have translated whale language the way you would translate French into English. It does not mean researchers can now type a sentence and have it converted into whale sound with equivalent meaning. And it certainly does not mean anyone has had an actual back-and-forth conversation with a sperm whale. What the AI analysis actually revealed is something narrower, but still genuinely significant. That the acoustic architecture underlying sperm whale communication is considerably more structured, more language-like in its basic building blocks than the prevailing scientific assumption held for the past 6 decades. That is a discovery about structure, not about meaning. Researchers now have strong evidence that whale codas are built from smaller, combinable, vowel-like and diphthong-like components, rather than simple, undifferentiated clicks, which is a genuinely important step toward eventually understanding what, if anything, specific patterns actually communicate. But identifying that a system has grammar-like structure is a different achievement from knowing what any particular utterance within that structure actually means. And Project CETI's own researchers have been consistently careful to draw that distinction themselves, rather than overstating what the data shows. It helps to understand a little more about how a generative adversarial network actually works, since the choice of tool here is genuinely clever and explains why this approach succeeded where purely manual analysis had not. A generative adversarial network operates using 2 competing components, one that tries to generate synthetic examples matching the statistical properties of real training data, and another that tries to distinguish those synthetic examples from genuine ones, with the 2 components essentially training against each other in a continuous feedback loop until the generator becomes extremely good at reproducing the underlying statistical structure of whatever it was trained on. Applied to whale codas, this approach let researchers examine the acoustic architecture of the sounds at a level of statistical precision that would be effectively impossible using traditional manual spectral analysis, revealing subtle recurring patterns in pitch and timing that human researchers, no matter how experienced, had never been positioned to detect simply by listening or by examining individual recordings one at a time. This is really the core reason AI has changed this field so significantly. It is not that the technology understands whale meaning in some intuitive way. It is that it can process volumes of acoustic data and detect statistical regularities at a scale and precision that manual human analysis was never realistically capable of achieving. It is also worth understanding just how much groundwork had to happen before this kind of AI analysis was even possible, because the story of Project CETI is really a story about infrastructure as much as it is a story about algorithms, recording enough high-fidelity whale communication to meaningfully train and validate. Machine learning models required years of dedicated fieldwork, developing specialized biologging tags precise enough to capture clean audio from a diving whale hundreds of feet underwater, refining aerial and aquatic drone footage to pair vocalizations with observable social behavior, and building out an entire multidisciplinary team spanning 8 institutions and roughly 50 researchers working across artificial intelligence, cryptography, linguistics, marine biology, and robotics. None of the pattern recognition breakthroughs described here would have been possible without that unglamorous, years-long process of simply gathering enough clean, well-documented data in the first place. The same basic lesson that keeps showing up across nearly every field where AI has recently produced a genuine breakthrough. The algorithm did not do the hard part alone. It did the part that became possible only once years of patient fieldwork had produced a dataset large and clean enough to actually learn from.